Thank you. So the speaker today, Lucian Wong, the DPhil from Oxford, and he is currently a Baba Bhuman Shah Fellow of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. Lucian is also editor of the Journal of Hindu Studies, published by the Oxford University Press, and general editor of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies Mandala Publishing Series. He is a specialist in colonial Hindu intellectual history and vernacular religion in early modern and modern Bengal. He has taught Hinduism, Buddhism, Indian philosophy, and Bengali literature to students in undergraduate, postgraduate, and continuing education context, and has led research projects on Hinduism and colonial modernity, body and embodiment in Middle Bengali literature, the Vaishnava sensorium, and AI and machine learning technologies in Indic language textual scholarship. His current monograph project on devotional transformation, Vaishnavism, modernity, and the vertical self offers a study of the life and religious work of the late colonial Bengali Vaishnava leader Kedarnath Datta Bhakti Vinod. The book both challenges an entrenched diffusionist master narrative surrounding the emergence of modernity in the subcontinent and proffers a template for studying religious agents that does not lose sight of the essential drive to self-transformation to which religious life frequently gives expression. He is also currently co-editing volumes on bodily technologies in the Middle Bengali imaginary, embodiment, ecstasy, immortality, which is coming out from Bloomsbury, and also another one which is coming out from the State University of New York Press, titled Pluralizing Hinduism in the Empire of Reform. And Lucian is also co-editor-in-chief of the Oxford Handbook of Gauriya Vaishnavism Studies, which is published by the Oxford University Press. So this is in brief about Lucian, and we'll get to know more from his presentation today. Over to you, Lucian.
Thank you so much. Should I press this to speak into the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Anindya, Murshid, Dr. Guha, the faculty of ILSR, and our visitors today, Professor Amir Shane, Rajashi. Thank you so much for coming. I've been hosted so graciously. It's been wonderful to be here and meet you all. Before I begin today, we've heard already of Professor Tony Stewart, but I thought that I'm here precisely because of Tony's connection. You know, that he perhaps gave what was perhaps his last academic lecture, potentially, to the center, he was a great, dear friend, mentor, deeply informed my approach to the study of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, of which he was a titan in the field, a student of the great Edward Dimmock. You see here, this is his last published book. He was standing proudly with it, Needle at the Bottom of the Sea, on his translations, sort of accompanying translations to his Witness to Marvels of the Pirkata. And it was actually, the talk today is also connected very much to Tony, in that my initial meeting with him back in 2014, about 10 years ago it was, at the British Library, centered both on conversations surrounding his 2010 monograph, The Final Word, which was a study of the Chaitanya Charitamrita of Krishnadas Kaviraj, as well as, at that time, we also discussed an early seminal article that he wrote, an essay that remained unpublished for quite a few decades, actually, entitled, well, the initial title was something like Sex and Secrecy in the study of, you know, in relation to the study of the Sahajiyas, the Vaishnava Sahajiyas. We after inviting him to a 2015 conference at which Professor Sain was present to in 2015 in Oxford on Vaishnavism in colonial Bengal, we managed to entice him to publish that essay in our book under the title, updated title of The Power of the Secret, the tantalizing discourse of Vaishnava Sahajiya scholarship. The article, the chapter, the book chapter now, itself addresses a number of topics in relation to the study of the Sahajiyas. But a key takeaway for me at the time was very much, perhaps speaking to some of the themes of this research cluster, problematizing the notion of tradition when we study the Sahajiyas, that so much of the scholarship, the notion of a sort of unified system pervades that scholarship. And Tony, as sort of pervades much of his work, like to problematize nouns and is much more in favor of the adjectival uses of words. So Sahajiya, italicized, adjectively, rather than turning it into a thing, this one thing that which this notion of a sort of a monolithic heterodoxy, if you will, also pervades early scholarship as well as present-day scholarship on Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I take my cue from that, in a sense, by applying that approach to a degree, that insight, to problematizing the notion of the orthodox too. Yeah, which actually sometimes features in both those studying the Gaudiya tradition as well as those more rooted in the study of heterodox traditions, quote-unquote heterodox traditions. The orthodoxy, the mainstream, and my sort of point of entry to that is the basic sense that you prod that orthodoxy anywhere. And I know Tony his final word was this, in a sense, about the production of a very powerful orthodoxy, a discursive orthodoxy in the shape of Krishnadas's monumental Charitamrita. And no doubt that has great weight, but there's always surplus, there's always the unsaid, there's always semantic density is a word that my supervisor Gavin Flood, my doctoral supervisor Gavin Flood, likes to use. There's a density to meaning here, which is not exhausted by simply one interpretation, which allows for a whole deal of directions things can take. So my sense is that you prod that orthodoxy anywhere, and actually it opens up into a great plurality, and fluidity as well. So that's the basic orientation today, hence mainstream in scare quotes. So we're looking at Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and this is an artwork produced in the mid-19th century by the Kolkata Art Studio, great, lovely, colourful, but representing some of the, one of the great sort of themes of the Gaudiya Vaishnava world, right? Passionate devotion, ecstatic devotion, tears, rolling on the ground, etc. Radha. And so the key points I want to make today, essentially, is that even in its most passion-centered forms, that devotion practiced by the Gaudiya Vaishnavas is undergirded by techniques. It's not just a random thing, of course. Sometimes the word spontaneous is used, but there's a great background of practice and training, to get there. Often body-centered, very much body-centered in the realm of Raga Nuga sadhanas. That this regimen of techniques is actually a lot less stable than is generally assumed. That over time, this Raga Nuga sadhana becomes increasingly formalized or procedural. And it's given its distinctive shape in the way that we know it today from the resources of Tantra, or more specifically Pancharatra Tantra. And I use that in a sort of more later sense, this sort of early modern Narada Pancharattra, but we'll get more onto that later. So I'm going to approach this talk today by looking at 4 key phases. The first inceptive moment in the earlier theoreticians of the tradition in the 16th century. Then I look at the way that this Raganuga sadhana takes shape amongst their successors in the 2nd generation. Then I turn to a parallel current, a quote-unquote parallel current, which has the most direct significance for contemporary modalities of this practice, this devotional practice. And then I want to look at a 4th moment that is dated anywhere between the early 18th to possibly the late 19th, although I would suggest somewhat earlier than that moment, which I think sheds light in how we get from 2 to 3, which I think this shift from 2 to 3 represents something of a paradigm shift. And so the moment that I'm looking at the end of my talk, this phase 4, I think provides a beginning to shedding some light in how we can understand the transition from the earlier phase, earlier modalities of Raganuga sadhana to the forms that it takes today that have become essentially understood as the standard for Raganuga sadhana. So to begin with then, some basics. I know that not everyone here is a Gaudiya Vaishnava scholar, so for those who are, please forgive me for telling you stuff that you already know. So the locus classicus for the Gaudiya understanding of bhakti or devotion is Rupa Goswami's mid-16th century Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. And it's in here where we find the canonical, perhaps the first formulation of the notion of there being 2 modalities of devotion, of bhakti. One being injunctive, or vaiti, and the other passion pursuant, or raganuga, so anuga, raga. Yeah? So hence, it's a little bit of a clunky expression, rather than just passionate devotion, but it's more precise. It's passion pursuant devotion. It's not yet passionate. The primary basis for this distinction is actually, according to Rupa Goswami, is its motivational source, and this is key to my formulation here, or to my representation of the early modalities of Raganuga sadhana. So it's motivation driven, and that Rupa Goswami in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu only names one criteria for what distinguishes something as constituting Raganuga sadhana, and that is being greedy, or having the lobha, to obtain the mood or bhava of those who are exclusively fixed in ragatmika bhakti, such as, most notably, the residents of Braja, that we find expressed in texts like the Bhagavata Purana. These are the ragatmika bhaktas in these texts. They are the passionate devotees. And the practitioner, the sadhaka, is following that mood. They are greedy for the mood of these paradigmatic bhaktas. So it's raganuga bhakti. And it's only the greed to obtain that which distinguishes that practice as raganuga. Now, in spite of the centrality of this notion of raganuga in the Gaudiya context, it receives surprisingly little attention in the works of the early Gaudiya theoreticians. Most notably in Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, only 3 verses in that text, which I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of verses are in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, but only 3 of them directly pertain to articulating what Raganuga sadhana is. Yeah? And this is mirrored in other Gaudiya treatises too. So I should mention here also that Rupa spends many hundreds of verses formulating what Vaidhi sadhana is, this more injunctive devotion. which is sometimes said to be constituted by 64 limbs, beginning with taking shelter of the Guru, etc., etc., etc. And his formulation in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, or the proportionality, because the Bhakti Sandarbha, the Sandarbhas of Jiva Goswami, for instance, is a longer treatise, mirror this proportionality. And then again, we have extensive exposition on what Vaidhi sadhana is, and only comparatively little on what Raganuga is. And this is surprising because it's so central to the tradition. It's what distinguishes the tradition according to the authors of the tradition. Now, most commonly in scholarship, this has been understood as, and not just in the scholarship, also in sort of contemporary practitioner settings, a deliberate act of concealment. As Tony himself puts it, Rupa is concealing this, and the other Gaudiya authors are concealing this so that the unguided or perhaps misguided adventurer might not inadvertently stumble into an experience that might exceed his experience or his capacity. So this is what I call the esoteric framing of Raganuga. It's being hidden. Yeah? It's terse because there's something behind it, but it's hidden, and presupposes the existence of an independent technical regimen that corresponds to what Raganuga practices. In perhaps the the landmark scholarly treatment in recent decades of this practice, an excellent work by David Haberman, he frames it as slightly different, but along similar, as a Rupa is developing here a skeletal system that is going to be now unfolded by later authors, developed. But actually he wanted to say more, but he was only giving the bare bones. I suggest, however, and this is key to everything that I say later, that we take this terseness. What if we take this terseness more at face value? That is to say, what Rupa says is simply what there is. That passion pursuant practice, this would entail that passion pursuant practice is largely devoid of any such independent technical regimen. Yeah? Nothing's being hidden. And this is indicated by the fact that the definition that I highlighted earlier is centered on motivation, not anything external, not any specific practice as such, but motivational framing. Whether lopa is present, it's not defined by procedure. Indeed, in one of the three verses that Rupa gives us in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, he indicates that essentially Raganuga sadhana shares the same basic regimen as Vaidhi sadhana. That is, the learned, this is quoting Rupa now, the learned understand the aforementioned limbs of injunctive devotion in Vaidhi, such as hearing, chanting, and the like. These are all present in passion pursuant practice in Raganuga sadhana. Of course, it's not to say that these are entirely identical. There is, once you get to this treatment of Raganuga, there is an emphasis on smaran, remembrance, contemplation. Sometimes people say visualization, but I don't think that word is appropriate here. It's also Siddha Deha oriented. This new concept emerges in Rupa's treatment of this form of practice, where he says, and this is again one of the other three verses, following after the inhabitants of Braja, one should perform service, seva, in one's practitioner form, sadhaka rupa, and in one's perfected form. This is now the introduction of this new concept of the Siddha Deha or Siddha Rupa, with a desire for a particular bhava. Yeah? Jiva furthermore defines the Siddha Deha as an internally conceived antashchintita body deha suitable for one's desired service. Okay, so we then get texts that seem to be centered on the practice of smarana, this Leela Smaran. Most notably, Rupa Goswami's very short text. There are doubts as to whether this is actually Rupa's text, but most conventionally attributed to Rupa is Ashtakali Leela Smarana Mangala Stotra, which pertains to the 8. So if the Leela of Radha and Krishna is seen as a sort of cycle, the day, the 8 portions of that day, this now in a sort of skeletal form details the activities of this 8-fold daily cycle. Then you have the much more extensive text by Krishna Das Kaviraj, same author as the Charitamrita, the Govinda Lilamrita, which is a expansion, and later authors, this Radhakrishna Goswami, the 16th century author, sees this as an expansion of the Govinda, of the Ashtakali Leela Smarana Mangala Stotra. Very significantly, I feel, is that this text centers and it's a narrative text about these leelas of Radha Krishna and their associates. There's no formal procedure indicated in this work, despite the fact that Krishnadas Kaviraj, he specifically says that the work, and this is at the end of the text, this is for the Raga Dwasadhakaja, those who are given to Raga, who are given to Raga, those practitioners oriented to Raga. And then you have, of course, the Padavali corpus, which I think these are the key sources for the practice of Smaran. But the way that I would suggest, and I'm taking inspiration here from my colleague and friend Rambert Lutcher Harms, the way that he frames it, the dominant practice then for the Raganuga sadhaka becomes meditation on the divine play of Krishna, which in theory could replace all other forms of practice, but normally simply infuses all those other forms of vaidhi, like praising, image worship, with that meditation. So you're doing exactly the same thing, but now you're being driven by a desire for the mood of the Ragatmika Bhaktas, which then takes shape in these leelas that are being articulated, that are being expressed by these early authors. Now we're moving on to the second moment among the second generation. We see here in the late 16th, early 17th, it crystallizes, let's say, by the mid 17th. Over time, a shift in the emphasis of the Raganuga practitioner. You see in the tradition, whereas in Rupa's text, he outlines 5 different kinds of relationship that one can have with God, that one has with Krishna, that are exemplified in texts like the Bhagavata Purana. So servitude, friendship, parental love, so these are 4. There's also Shantarasa, which is not dealt with so much by the Gaudiya theologians, and then Madhura Rasa, so being a lover of God. Now over time, we see prominence given to a specific ideal for the Raganuga practitioner. That's the notion of the Manjari, or the slightly junior gopi, the handmaiden, the assistant of the Sakhis, yes, these Manjaris. We're said to be around 13, something like that. This is the specific number is given, the age is given by these authors. Such that over time, Raganuga sadhana comes to be, by this period, identified almost exclusively with Manjari sadhana. So now one is striving to attain the bodily form and practices of the Manjari. This is of course presaged in the writings of early authors like Rupa, Raghunath Das Goswami, in texts like his Mukha, and also notably Kavi Karnapur. And we see this in a text like his Gaura Ganadish Deepika, which gives all the corresponding identities of the participants in the Chaitanya Leela with those in the corresponding Krishna Leela. So Lalita Saki, etc. Rupa Goswami, Rupa Manjari, etc. So those are there. But it's not really until authors such as Narottam Das and his colleagues, that's Srinivas Acharya, who Tony's final word deals with it quite extensively, and are dealt with a lot in these second generation biographies, such as Prem Vilas, Narottam Vilas, Bhakti Ratnakar, which is early 18th century. However, most notably, in the works of authors like Narottam Das, specifically in his padas, his poetry, as well as his practice-oriented text, Manjari practice, Manjari sadhana, remains distinctly unformalized. There's no specific regimen for being for practicing to be a Manjari. It's expressed actually most prominently in the mood of lalasha, the hankering for, the deep greed for, which again corresponds, I would say, is in continuity with Rupa Goswami's definition of what Raganuga practice is, distinguished by motivation or greed. And interestingly, I think this is a dead giveaway regarding the lack of any formal procedure here or distinct theorization. In some of these second generation biographies, such as Prem Vilas, Bhakti Ratnakara, and Karnananda by Jadunandan Das, there is the inclusion of letters in Sanskrit between Jiva Goswami in Vrindavan, who was seen as, at the time, the sort of head theologian of the tradition, and his disciples, or his students in Narottam Das, Srinivas, etc., where in some of these letters, and they're reproduced in these different biographies, some have a few letters, some just have a couple. In there, these chief missionaries, if you will, of the Gaudiya tradition, now tasked with spreading Goswami Grantha to Bengal, they are expressing confusion in these letters regarding what the Siddha Deha is. This fundamental concept of Raganuga sadhana, Srinivas, one of the great acharyas of this generation, is expressing. So what exactly is the, can you just repeat what the Siddha Deha is? And this is, we get then the definition, Jiva Goswami gives the Santas Chintita Deha, form definition. But that's a dead giveaway of any lack of formal regimen, process, theorization of Raganuga sadhana at that time. This is not the case, however, when we come to this third moment now I'm turning to, this quote-unquote parallel moment. So it's neither Rupa nor Narottam Das who provide the formulation identified most ubiquitously with Manjari sadhana today. For this, we need to turn to a triad of Sanskrit manuals, or padhatis, all going somewhat confusingly by the name Gaur Govindarchana Smarana Padhati, traditionally attributed to these three authors, Gopal Guru Goswami, who was the Mahant of the Radhakanta Mata in Puri, his disciple, Dhyana Chandra Goswami, Gopal Guru is roughly late 16th century, he would have been producing this text. Dhyana Chandra Goswami, the early to mid 17th century, writing this text, and slightly later in the late 18th century, Siddha Krishnadas Baba, working in Vrindavan, Govardhan. These are all Sanskrit texts, and then you have, perhaps most commonly distributed work, the vernacular Bangla expansion, going by the title Gol Govinda Lilamrita Gutika, or simply the Gutika hill. Yeah. So these are the works that define contemporary understandings of Raga Nuga Sadhana. And as I said, these are almost universally perceived as the standard of Raga Nuga Sadhana, and more specifically Manjari Sadhana. In her 2015 work, The Place of Devotion, Sukanna, who we were speaking about earlier today, and I believe has connections with many of you, notes in her ethnography of the various modalities of Vaishnavism and Vaishnava practice in Navadvip, that only one of the Goswamis who she spoke with did not practice this Padati-based Manjari Sadhana, but even they could speak a lot about it. And we also know that from works such as the likes of Neil Delmonico and Aditya Sharpa, they wrote an interesting essay, and quite a lot of other places. This form of Padati-based Manjari practice also features in quite a bit of Shahajiya type material, where it's seen as forming either the Pravartika or Shadak stage of practice for Shahajiya, so the earlier phases of practice for the Shahajiya practitioners. And so in their work on these Shahajiya notebooks, I don't know whether this has been published anywhere, but it's available in these, on Neil Delmonico's academia.edu page. He writes his observation there when looking at these Shahajiya notebooks, essentially is that it's premised on a lot of, it was sharing quite a bit of this Manjari Padati-based practice. So supposing the notebook to have been the property of practicing Shahajiya, we may then note that certain ideas and their expansion are shared by Orthodox and Shahajiya alike. Manjari practice is one of those, while certain others are peculiar to the latter. So some of the basic components of Padati practice. Firstly, it requires a separate initiation or dikka into the practice, often termed Chitta Pranali dikka, which is at which point one is given knowledge of this Ekadasa Bhava, sometimes 12, sometimes generally 11 aspects, Bhava, of one's Manjari form, including name, complexion, age, as we spoke earlier, dress, relationship, etc., etc., as well as the corresponding Ekadasa Bhava throughout one's Guru Parampara. Yeah? So one will then learn these one's Guru's Manjari form, the Parama Guru's Manjari form, etc., etc., etc. And these often then take the shape of these Siddha Pranali charts that we have here. This is connected with the Nityananda Holy, as you can see. Chitta Guru Pranali. So next then, another central component is this Jogopitambuja, or lotiform visualization. Maybe that word needs to change. Sorry, I won't go into that issue now. I'm dealing at the moment with this project on the sensorium, where I think this visual prioritization is maybe a biases that we have sometimes. Of course, these sort of mandala forms pervade the tantric world, as Gavin Flood has put it. There's a great sort of, an impressive ritual invariance across theological diversity amongst tantric ritual practice. But we can see the specificity of this loti form in that it prioritizes, as we can see in the hexagonal shape there, this mantra, the 6 points, Kling Krishnaya. So we can see that it's the Kama Bij, Gopala mantra is prioritized in this form. And you see in this form you would have Radha Krishna in the center, then the 8 Sakis, then the Manjaris lower down, being the assistants of the Sakhis. This also gives you some visual representation of why the Manjari form is important in this context, because despite being younger and perhaps participating less directly in the love play of Radha and Krishna, they are very close to it. It's a position of great intimacy. And we see here that then the centrality of the Kama bead in Gopala mantra here indicates that it has its source in what is often referred to as the Narada Pancharatra sort of North Indian tradition, associated with texts such as the Kramalipika, the Gopal Kapadi Upanishad, Gautamiya Tantra, Brihat Brahma Samhita, and the Brahma Samhita, or sometimes dated to the 13th, early 14th century. And then we have also in the Padati practice the incorporation not just of this Yoga Pitambuja associated with Radha and Krishna, but now the insertion of a Yoga Pitambuja associated with Gora Lila. Yeah, so the corresponding Gora forms of these personalities, which comes to be embedded within the practice, taking shape in a sort of parallel way. And we see as sort of over time, if the Padatis can be dated sequentially, we do trace in them a sort of increasing synthesis between these two parallel modes of worship, Gaura Lila and Krishna Lila. Yeah. As well as we also have another characteristic feature of this practice is what's called the synchronic or the mantropasana worship, which is everything stops and now everyone takes their positions in this lotiform shape, the mandala, and doing puja, and then again moving on to the lila-like flow, which is called the swarasiki. So this Padati practice integrates these two modes of worship. Okay, so I would say that this, with its very distinct technical regimen, constitutes a reframing of Raganuga sadhana, a paradigm shift, I'm suggesting, along distinctly tantric lines. What I mean by tantric is Narada Pancharatric. And this is contrary to the slackening of Pancharatric ritual techniques, which is advocated by early 18th century canonical Gaudiya authors such as Vishwanath Chakravarti, for example, in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu commentary, or also other works on Raganuga sadhana like the Raga Bhakma Chandika, wherein he is, in relation to this, he's saying that, yes, we retain most of the Vinti practices, except for those associated with Pancharatric ritual techniques, such as Nyasa, Bhuta Shuddhi, etc., etc. These can fall away. They're not that conducive for Raganuga sadhakas. So this reframing is therefore, along Pancharatric lines, is somewhat in tension with the way that we see Raganuga sadhana take place even in the early 18th century among these, or late 17th, early 18th century in authors like Vishwanath. Now there are questions surrounding the provenance of the Padatis that virtually no one has raised yet, which has been a little surprising. This is both within scholarship. So David Haberman, in his excellent study, when he's dealing with the Padatis, deals with Rupa Goswami, deals with the Narottam moment, and then around this same time, a couple of decades later, we then get the appearance of the Padatis, and this sits side by side, not really digging a little further into the somewhat uneasy relationship that these two modalities of Raganuga have. This is also the understanding of practitioners themselves. So the likes of Karanath Datta Bhakti Vinod, who was the subject of my doctoral thesis, and is the sort of grandfather of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, the Gaudiya Math, and all these sorts of what are sometimes termed neo-Vaishnav movements. There are problems, and I haven't done lots of work here, so this is now just gesturing toward what I think some of the issues are. The extant manuscripts are all fairly late, so the Haridas Das' sort of canonical published edition of this of the Padatis really rests on two, in most cases, manuscripts from dated to the late 19th, early 20th century. Perhaps more notably, there's a complete absence of reference to these texts where you would expect them to feature very prominently in authors, particularly the likes of Vishwanath Chakravarti, Narahari Chakravarti, his early 18th century Bhakti Ratnakara. There's no reference to these Padati texts at all. The Gutika itself, which is now the most sort of ubiquitous vehicle through which Padati framing of Raganuga Sadhana takes shape, has an extremely murky history. There are three, notably three published editions of the work, maybe with sometimes going through a number of editions themselves, attributed to Gopal Das Baba, or sometimes referred to as Mani Puri Gopal Das Baba, Madan Mohan Das Baba, and Ananta Das Babaji. However, in their bhumikas to these works, firstly, each of these published editions take very different shapes. None of them are the same, all of them quite different. And not just little, variants, but different texts, essentially, these are. Plus, each of them acknowledges that they didn't have access to any original Gutika. They were hearing, they were essentially intuiting. In one case, in the case of Madan Mohan Das, his guru, Shaki Charan Das Babaji, extremely staunch Vairagi, Braj-based, I believe, said that at one point he had discovered 40 Gutikas, 40 different Gutikas. So this is essentially a very fluid landscape of personal practice. Yeah, that these then becomes the canonical. Yeah, this is now associated with orthodoxy, the mainstream. I would also suggest that if the Gutika or the Padati tradition is somewhat later, is not late 16th, 17th century works, but they're quite a bit later, it would also help us to make sense of something that I encountered in my work on Vaishnavism in Bengal, in colonial Bengal, in a lot of the patrikas that we were speaking about earlier, and elsewhere in some of the books. You have a lot of mention of debates surrounding the validity of what's known as the Gaura mantra, essentially the eternality of Gaura worship. And I could never quite work out why this, no one's really, so Bibi Majumdar has noted this, and he even mentions in his Chaitanya Charitarupadan that this debate got so heated in the early 20th century that at this Vishnu Priya Ghosh, this Mahaprabhu Bari, I think it is, in Navadip, there was a great sort of gathering of pundits and babas, practitioners, almost 700, he said, and it got so intense, it broke out into physical fighting surrounding the validity of the Gaura mantra. If this, why does it happen at this time and not before? Perhaps because the Padati texts only, which are the ones that seem to, these I would suggest are the ones that introduce the centrality of Gaura mantra in Gaudiya practice. If they're later, it makes sense that suddenly it becomes a massive issue. This is all circumstantial evidence. This is not proof positive, but I'm suggesting there's a lot of motivation for digging deeper into this issue. Yeah. I don't require this, however. I don't require this to establish the lateness of the Padati, but just to provide some context for what I think might, shed some light on this. So now I turn to the fourth moment, and this is one of the sources. So in one sense, I'm not doing sources in the plural. I'm looking at one source to begin an investigation into rethinking Raganuga. Yeah. So this is now this Bongshi Shikha, which I've been doing a fair amount of work on over the past couple of years, which is attributed to one Premdas Mishra, ostensibly early 18th century, and associated. So it recounts a dialogue, mainly. The bulk of the text, there's four, I think they're called vilasas, 4 chapters. The first 3 of them pertain to the Shikha of Chaitanya to Vamshivadan, who's a junior contemporary of Chaitanya, on the eve of his sannyas ceremony. So just before he's about to leave his home, his wife, his mother, and everything. And notably, Bongshi is also a Pada. There's a Bongshi that's a Pada writer, possibly the same Bongshi, who only produces about 6 Padas, but a number of those deal with Nimai Sannyas, and the lament, the Viroha, that Shachi, Chaitanya's mother, his wife are feeling at that time. So this text is associated with the Bhagnapada Vaishnavas. Bhagnapada is in northeast Bardhaman district, approximately 25 kilometers south of Navadip, immediately west of Ambika Kalna. It's a Vaishnava Shripad that traces ancestral descent from Vamshi Vadanananda Thakur, who I've mentioned, late 15th century born, and his father, Brahmin Madhav Chattor, is known as. And the Shripad is established by one Ramachandra Goswami, or Ramai Thakur, in what was said to be the bush-covered and desolate, in a bush-covered and desolate area inhabited by tigers. So Shukumar Shain in 1588, and there seems to be archaeological evidence of that date. Yeah, Shukumar Shain gives the sort of source of the name Bhagnapada. He uses the etymology to Vyagra Vanapatak. So the Patak would be like the doing away with somehow, the forest of tigers. Ramai Thakur is also associated with Janavamana, who is the second wife of Nityananda, the associate of Chaitanya, who's very famous in Bengal, whose other identity is said to, so I won't go into all the details here. The Bhagnapada tradition, and she is said to have adopted Ramai Thakur as her son. She was childless, and she was also sometimes said to be the leader of the Vaishnavas after the departure of Nityananda, the Goswamis in Braj. She rose to a position of great prominence in the tradition, and there were many different paramparas stemming from her. So one of them is this one, through Ramai Thakur. The Bhagnapada tradition, however, also has strong links has strong Shahajiya connections. Yeah, Shahajiya should be with a small s. Different Shahajiya groups. In texts like the Murali Vilas, another text associated with the Bhagnapada tradition, we find the story of this famous Veer Chandra Prabhu, said to be is the son of Nityananda, with his other wife, Vasudha, was said to have initiated these, I don't know whether it was, do you know the number? 1,500, sometimes 3,000, I don't know, it's like shaven-headed Nadas, yeah, exactly. These Nadas, followers of the Buddhist Shahajayan, these sort of, this thing. So some see this as the entry of Shahajayan into the Vaishnava fold. Yeah, some suggest. Also, perhaps more tangibly, Kinchan Das, author of the Vivarta Vilas, I don't know the details here specifically, but has some disciplic connection with the Bhagnapada community. Karan Bihari Goswami, who was at the University of Kolkata in the Bangla department there, he details this in one of the chapters of his what was his doctoral thesis, and it's published as Bhagnapada Shamprilayo Vaishnav Shadita. Excellent work. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but he was a great source on the Bhagnapada community. Now, there's been a, sorry, how am I doing for time here? Okay, I tried to, sorry, I tried to, there's been quite a bit of contention surrounding, not a whole lot of scholarship on the Vongshi Shika, but where it has appeared, there's been quite a bit of controversy in the scholarship surrounding how to frame it. B.B. Majumdar, his Chaitanya Charita sees it as a late forgery, sees it as drawing heavily on the Murali Vilas, which itself he sees as a late forgery. And one of his reasons for this is it's anachronistic, but not in the historian sense of anachronistic, but simply that it doesn't cohere with existing narratives in the tradition, which I find an interesting use of anachronism. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. He also frames it as a Shahajiya text, primarily because of what he sees as the use of the expression Anukul Lasheba, which he attributes to the vowels. Shukumar Shain didn't frame it as Shahajiya explicitly, but aligned it, one of the key practices, or the main practice articulated in the Vongshi Shika, the Rasaraj Upasana, with Narahari Sarkar and his group, with Shrikant, who are associated with this Gaura Nagadavad, a kind of that ends up being sidelined by the main tradition because it emphasizes Chaitanya as the lover. It's a lot of the Gaudiya don't like to use the sannyas, but the Gaura Nagadavadis specifically cultivate the mood of, being a woman in Navadip. And when Chaitanya passes, the poetry is written that Chaitanya passes with his sidelong, the corner of his eye makes the saris fall down of the women of Navadip. So this is seen, Vrindavan Das in his Chaitanya Bhagavat explicitly denounces the Gaura Nagadavadis. Dimmock, drawing on Shukamar Shain, it appears, also identifies it with the Gaura Nagadavad, and partly because of this, he sees the Gaura Nagadavad as a kind of Shahajiya practice, as does Hitesh Ranjan Sanyal, and also sees the Bhagnapada community as Shahajiya from the outset. But I should say, not to put too much weight on this, because he essentially sees everyone, including possibly even Chaitanya himself, as practitioners of Shahajiya Vaishnava modalities. So I don't need to read this here. So. On the other hand, the likes of Joe O'Connell, another great stalwart we've lost, as well as Ramakanta Chakrabarti, in his Vaishnavism in Bengal, and Ganavi Hari Goswami, as I mentioned, they see it somewhat differently. This view is expressed by Ramakanta Chakrabarti. I think I will read this one. Some Bhagnapada Vaishnavas felt the necessity of introducing into the concepts of the circle a radical element. One can only presume that the necessity of radicalizing the ideas of the circle had some connection with the growing influence of the Shahajiyas during the 17th and 18th century, but the radical group of Bhagnapada Vaishnavas was not fully prepared to deviate from the orthodox line. So it's a kind of, it's orthodox, but they're needing to incorporate some Sahajiya things really just to appease what was the sort of zeitgeist at the time, but they retained their orthodoxy. So seeing it like that. I think a lot of the controversy, no one really mentions this, but I think it is to do with what a feature of the third and the first half of the fourth vilasa of the text, which pertains to what Premdas refers to as manmatamatam, the churning of Cupid. So I'll just read some of this. The devotional connoisseurs, the Rasik Bhaktas, they always drink, and now the language here becomes, potentially could be read as somewhat tantric, as the nectar that oozes from the churning of Cupid. When Cupid is churned, one meets Madan, the Aprakrita Cupid. Yeah. The 5 arrows of Manmata are extremely astonishing, etc. Then he goes into what one needs to do to churn Cupid. I'm now telling you the procedure of churning Cupid, which is important. You churn Cupid situated in the toes with the Govinda mantra, with Bij and Nam. According to the stipulations of scripture, you churn Kama. Now, Kama is traveling. Kama means Cupid, or lust, travel throughout the body, the different days of the lunar month. Beginning in the toes, Kama travels up the body. Yeah? and then to the left-hand side, like that. So he's saying we now need to churn karma on these days. So on these days, on each of the days where karma stan, where karma is residing, we need to churn with Govinda mantra on this day, the toes, etc., etc. And then also the genitalia, you need to churn Cupid on a certain day, all the way up to the shikha, etc., and then do the other side. And women and men do it differently. Okay? Observations. Now this concept of the places of karma is post 11th century Karma Shastra, and as Dowd-Ali has written an excellent article on this. The text itself, the Vamshi Shikha, actually uses a Karma Shastra text, the Smara Shastra it's called, as one of its sources for this idea of the churning of Cupid, and refers to it as a praman. Also, this notion of the movement of calm throughout the body pervades tantric and yogic milieu, as we find in the work of David Cushman, Dermody, and the like, and Glenn Hayes. And we might say that even the notion of the churning of Cupid is somewhat ambiguous, because I'm translating here as manmatamatan, could be seen as churning, yeah, which is ostensibly alchemical, the sublimation, the transformation, like the alchemical transformation of karma now into prem. So this alchemical model that David Gordon White is termed in those ways, it's central to yogic and tantric context. Yet I would suggest there's another reading of matan here, also destruction, can also be to subdue, not just to, either churning butter as transformation, also can be destroy, yeah? This passage seems to be drawing directly on the Hari Bhakti Vilas, which is a text of the Gaudiyas that outlines, canonical text of the Gaudiyas by Sanatana Goswami, that outlines Vaidhi ritual and roots itself directly in Narada Pancharatra texts. And there's, I didn't do the comparison here, but essentially this seems to be a variant expression of Bhuta, Shuti, and Nyasa, so Pancharatric practices. Yeah, so we see that is central here. And so I would say that the Vamshi Shikha, what it's most productively read as articulating a variant formulation of Raganuga Bhakti Sadhana. And we see this, that the text itself frames what it's doing at the very outset as Chaitanya now speaking to Vamshi about this Rasaraj Upasana, which it sees as a secret practice, saying that in his outer mood, Gaura, Chaitanya, the abode of good qualities, spread the names of Hare Krishna, Nam Sankirtan, yes, in this world. In his inner mood, Antaranga Bhav, to his inner devotional group, Antaranga Bhaktas, to his close circle, he gave the worship of Rasaraj Upasana. So I see this as another way of articulating Raganuga Sadhana. And we see there are some divergences between Padati and the Vamshi Shikha, in that the Vamshi Shikha surprisingly is linga focused, centered on linga, understood as Gopeshwara. No, is it not? Is it Gopeshwara Krishna? It's essentially linga seen as Krishna, and this is what in Bhagnapada they worship the linga as Krishna. To this day, there's no Gauda worship in Vamshi Shikha, not to my knowledge, and there's no obvious formulated Ekadasa Bhava that we find in the Padatis. However, it is Manjari oriented, and possibly also allusions to this practice of Siddha Pranali Diksha. Kama Bij and Gopal Mantra is central to the practice of Rasaraj Upasana. The Loti form visualization, Yoga Dambuja, is central to the practice of Raganuga Sadhana, of Rasaraj Upasana, and there's also a synthesis of the synchronic and the diachronic. So I suggest that there are great resonances, and so I see what the Vamshi Shikha is doing. It's not going, it doesn't take Raganuga in exactly the same direction as the conclusion as the Padati corpus, but moves it along similar lines. This ritual hyperformalization of the practice along the same lines as the Padati, and drawing distinctly on Pancharatric texts, reframing Raganuga Sadhana along Pancharatric lines. So this is then to say, this is a recapitulation. If Pancharatra in the Gaudiya context is associated with Vaidhi, this puja, all these sort of things, the Bhuta Shuddhi, etc., it's a recapitulation of Raganuga, of Vaidhi, at the heart of Raganuga practice. Now we know that the Vamshi Shikha itself ascribes itself to Premdas. In the end of the text it says he wrote it 4 years after writing another text he wrote, the Chaitanya Chandrodaya Kaumudi. Yet questions surrounding the provenance of the Vamshi Shikha do linger. The printed editions are all based on one manuscript that is no longer extant. Kanabhi Hari Goswami, before him, the son of Bhagavat Kumar Dev Goswami, Bhagavat Kumar Shastri. He was a professor at the University of Kolkata and a descendant, a son of one of the leading representatives of the Bhagavad community. He himself said he couldn't find another manuscript of the text. However, I would say it was discovered in the late 19th century by a disciple of one of the leading representatives of the Bhagavad community. But despite the fact that there are a lot of texts in this milieu being forged, Govindadas Karcha, we know, texts attributed to Prabodhananda Saraswati, etc. Whoever did, if this was a later text and not Premdas, I don't think there are strong arguments for linking this Vamshi Shikha to the Bhagnapada community, i.e. those who discovered the text and published it, the Bhagnapada Vaishnavas, were not those who composed it, because I just simply don't see, whereas in the case of texts like, for example, the work that Rebecca Mannering did on Advaita Prakash, she sees that as a forgery produced by these descendants of Advaita Acharya in Shantipur, and very clearly support the Shantipur Goswamis. This doesn't seem to support the late 19th century practices of the Bhagnapada community at all. Why do we know that? Because by the late 19th century, the Bhagnapada Vaishnavas were heavily invested in Padati-based practices. So the likes of Bipin Bihari Goswami produces a text like the Hari Bhakti Tarangani, wherein he very clearly prioritizes toward the end of the text Padati-based practices. We also know that Bhakti Vinod Thakur was a practitioner. Some don't know, he's connected with Bhagnapada community. He's the disciple of Bipin Bihari Goswami. Practicing, see, Siddha Pranali Char, Padati-based Raganuga sadhana. So, towards a conclusion, where might we take this? I think this examination problematizes the idea of which pervades Gaudiya scholarship, of a more or less stable orthopraxy from the 16th century all the way to today. That essentially is the thing that it's an idea that is surprisingly ubiquitous. Perhaps not surprising in the context of practitioners, but quite surprising in the context of scholarship. Yeah. So it shows that we see over time an increasing turn to the resources of a broader tantric mainstream to articulate rather. This crystallizes only in the early colonial period, I would suggest, and is a result of a felt need, I would say, to resolve the abiding ambiguity that persists in the early formulations of the tradition. Perhaps just you could explain that as an inherent pull within the human to increasingly formalize practice, or could also be a response to other things going on around with the proliferation of sahajiyas that are now appropriating Gaudiya ideas. We now need to do away with this ambiguity to clearly demarcate what it is that we're doing. I don't have any strong opinions there. I think all of these could be factors. But what I would say is that this represents a paradigm shift in the tradition that, and this is crucial here, and this relates back actually to my early work on the doctoral thesis, need not. So whenever we talk about shifts that happen around the colonial period, the tendency in historical scholarship is always to say, colonialism, this is the colonial moment, the influence of whatever it might be. But I would say this is a paradigm shift in the tradition that need not be attributed to any particular set of colonial factors, though these may, of course, impinge on the broader context, but need not be explained in terms of a sort of colonial rupture narrative. It's a different kind of shift, different kind of rupture, maybe within the tradition. So I'm sorry I took so long today. Thank you so much. That's it. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Lucian. As far as I am concerned, I'm still learning this field, and listening to, I could gather that it's so vast and complicated, so complex, and that too. What is so amazing about it is that it was practiced so widely by such a large number of people, and we have got no idea about it. So we are, colleagues are pursuing post-colonial studies and indigenous studies, um, but these are the areas that we need to focus on, and I think it will take us a lot of time and effort to understand the complexities, the varieties, the whole paraphernalia. I was listening to it very closely, and I could understand how widely spread it is. And also your concluding remark that scholars working on the Vaishnava system, the Vaishnava tradition, has focused mostly on the more or less stable orthopraxy, as you said. But you talked about the many-sidedness, the multiplicities within that orthodox system, and the evolutions which not necessarily can be attributed to the colonial shift, as you rightly pointed out, but also it evolved through different centuries, through different practices. But this is really very interesting. I have one or two questions definitely, but before I ask those, I would request those who are present. We are really fortunate to have Professor Amir Sen also, who is also a great scholar of Vaishnava tradition.
Okay.
So